Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to talk to you today about Bears Ears. My name is Sally Sharp, and I'm the Grassroots Regional Coordinator for Great Old Broads for Wilderness. And this is Audrey Glendenning.
Hi, I'm Audrey Glendenning. I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager at Great Old Broads.
And we are going to go ahead and get started. So Great Old Broads has been engaged in protecting public lands in Utah since the organization was founded in 1989. The area's archaeological sites were being degraded, off-road vehicles were destroying sensitive areas, and overgrazing impacted cultural and natural resources. In the 2000s, Broads developed a sophisticated monitoring protocol called the Healthy Lands Project. Using cameras and GPS, volunteers and staff had created a growing database of 200,000 photos of public lands documenting habitat destruction for off-road travel across the West, especially in Utah. When the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition was formed, Broads were very excited that the tribes were leading the effort. We sent letters of support and met with supporters and advocated in every possible way. We hosted the Bears Ears Broad Walk in 2016 to engage our members. We were at the public hearing in Bluff, Utah with Sally Jewell that year as well. When the previous administration illegally shrunk the monument, Broads became a standing declarant on the federal lawsuit. In 2022, we invited Regina Lopez Whiteskunk, Angelo Baca, Jake Palma, and Charissa Miijessepe-Wilson to participate in a conversation entitled Navigating Tribal Co-Management of Public Lands. Now we are joined by Charissa Miijessepe-Wilson, co-director, and Lauren Hanson, collaborative management and tribal support specialist of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. Welcome, Charissa and Lauren.
Hi, thank you, Sally and Audrey, for hosting us this evening, and hello to you all. Thank you for spending this next hour with us, and I know I'm really excited to talk to you all a little bit as a continuation of the webinar that Sally mentioned we hosted earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and let Lauren introduce herself really quickly, and then we have a lot of content for us to get into together. So I want to make sure that we have time for that, as well as some questions and some dialogue at the end. So Lauren.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see folks' faces. I feel like that's unusual for a webinar. We usually just see little black squares. So it's lovely to see all of your smiling faces. My name is Lauren Hanson. I'm the Collaborative Land Management and Tribal Support Specialist for the Coalition. And yes, I'm excited to share more about tribal collaborative management and the monument, as well as the resource management plan that has relatively recently come out.
Thank you. So with that, give me a moment here and I will start sharing our presentation that we have prepared for you all. And I can see Lauren's face. So Lauren, if you're seeing our presentation, thank you. Thumbs up. All right. So what we'd like to talk to you all about is broadly Indigenous stewardship at Bears Ears, and that can elicit a lot of different things. And so we're hoping to give you some tangible examples of what that means and kind of the implications that it has to folks like you and the way that we can really steward places in a responsible manner. Again, I am Charissa Miijessepe-Wilson. I am the co-director overseeing operations as well as our strategy work. And then joined again today, we have Lauren Hanson, who is the collaborative management and tribal support specialist. So all right, so as Sally has already mentioned for you all, we have been involved in each other's work at least since the beginning. And so we kept our kind of overview really high level, so that way we can get into some of the nitty gritty, the really exciting details of some of the land management processes and recommendations that we've been working on with the tribes. So who are we? We are the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. We are a group of 5 Southwestern tribes, including Zuni tribe, Ute Indian tribe, Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain Ute, and Hopi. And ultimately, they're all united and have agreed to come together and work as a group collectively to protect and preserve the cultural landscape that we now call Bears Ears. As you can see here, we have the monument as recognized in the 2016 Obama proclamation, but the way that we like to look at the landscape, and rather the monument, is kind of a bear as a side profile, and it has kind of the feather as part of the boundaries. You all likely know that we are the first successful tribal-led effort to achieve monument designation at the request of tribes. We're really grateful to all of the grassroots efforts like yourself, as well as Utah Nepakea, that actually allowed us to be really successful in achieving that monument designation, because that was really the launching point for all of the work that we've been able to do today. A couple of other notes that we do like to mention about who we are and kind of the precedent set forward by that initial Obama proclamation. This proclamation itself actually has created a pathway, and rather created a larger path for tribal people to have decision-making powers over off-reservation land. This is really important because as of right now, with the extent of going out and owning or buying back our own land, our jurisdiction as tribal nations are limited to tribal reservations. And I think, as this group likely knows, the United States has a complicated and rather very harsh history when it comes to the removal of Indigenous people. Most of the so-called United States was ancestral homelands. And so relatively speaking, most of the places that we all like to recreate and enjoy were Indigenous homelands at some point. And in fact, what Lauren and I will walk you through later is the reason that these places have been kept intact as well as they have is because of their direct ancestral connection to Indigenous people. One other thing I like to mention about the proclamation is it's one of the vehicles that has reinforced the legitimacy of traditional ecological knowledge. So part of what we're doing at Bears Ears is trying to demonstrate that not only is traditional ecological knowledge on the same standards as Western scientific knowledge, but rather we can make recommendations and management options stronger by weaving the two together. We do have an example for you later on. Okay, so really quickly, we are a non-for-profit organization, and we support the 5 coalition tribes as well as the Bears Ears Commission and all things Bears Ears. So that includes anything from fundraising to convening decision makers, hosting information sharing sessions, doing youth programming, anything that the tribes deem as a priority, the coalition here actually does on their behalf. Each of the tribes selects a representative to serve as a coalition leader. Tribes can actually select as many people as they would like. This is one of the tenets that we try to use at Bears Ears and has been really successful, which is really giving deference to tribes' individual tribal sovereignty. So that way they're able to show up in Bears Ears work the way that they see fit and the way that they see, the way that allows them to be best represented in the work according to their cultural and governmental backgrounds. Coalition staff work alongside leadership and with leadership to implement long-term visioning. And so one of the examples that we're going to provide later is the actual coalition-led land management plan, which is actually based in entirely Indigenous knowledge and values. And the other thing that I wanted to note is something really critical to our work is the Cultural Resources Advisory Committee. So this committee actually advises on all things pertinent to cultural and ceremonial practices. And so this particular body is a really critical piece to the success that we've had here at Bears Ears. And Lauren will kind of walk you through what that looks like later. Really briefly, here are this is a picture of most coalition staff, but we just wanted to give you a feel for who we are. So myself, co-director, I've already mentioned, I oversee operations and our partnerships. So all that means is I make sure that everything in the back of house is running, but I also oversee our long-term strategy, including strategic planning, our partnerships, branding, and our ramp up of the Bears Ears Commission. And then Lauren's specific role, I will let her tell you a little bit more about now.
Sure. I'm involved primarily with the Cultural Resources Subcommittee, but also on our land planning team. So it's where we kind of take the recommendations of the subcommittee and tribal leaders and sort of perform a facilitation role between the commission and the federal agencies to try to make sure that as much traditional Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge is incorporated into the final land management plan as possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And really quickly, those who are not here, my other co-director, Hillary Hoffman, we have a comms director, Ruben Pacheco, operations manager, Michael Garland. We have tribal stewardship and community engagement specialist, Hanson Gorman, operations and donor relations coordinator, Liberty Kinsell, and then cultural resources coordinator, Jenny Rosas. Hopefully, we will also have a few summer interns soon. So if we kind of fast forward a little bit, I've kind of, given you a brief history of how we got here. And then I wanted to walk us through where we are now. So that way we're able to demonstrate the work that we've done with the draft EIS RMP or the resources management plan. So where all this has culminated is we have been having discussions since 2016 about how we want to ultimately heal the land and how we want to restore connections to Bears Ears. And I say that because I've already given you the history that a lot of our tribes, because they were removed from Bears Ears, a lot of our younger people no longer know that they actually came from that place. And so some of the work that we're doing here at Bears Ears is trying to help our young people make connection and so that they feel like they are home when they come to Bears Ears. And you hear our tribal leaders talk about when you enter Bears Ears, and as many of you know, I heard you had a very exciting backpacking tour. There's a special feeling there, right? And so we are really trying to keep this place intact so that that feeling that you get, that sense of awe when you walk into Bears Ears, can be enjoyed by everybody. So while we're having these discussions, we're also trying to make that long-term visioning that I kind of mentioned to you before. So a really critical piece of this is consensus-based decision-making. This is one of the values that my next slide touches on, which is as Indigenous people, we're very dialogue oriented. We like to story, we like to see connections, we like to draw that relationality, not only between ourselves, but between what we're doing now and that 7 generations that you all have heard. And so in order for us to kind of collectively make a decision, it takes a long time to do that, right? But when we're doing all of these talks, we're having all of this dialogue, we're also establishing trust, we're creating expectations for each other and how we interact. And we're also we're having buy-in when we have all of these decisions. So I really like to stress that this consensus-based has allowed us to come as far as we have today. And then really quickly, part of my job, as you heard, is to help the tribes create institutions and processes that are more reflective of Indigenous values and lifeways. That seems like a really big flowery term, but to give you an example, so for instance, in when we are doing meetings, yes, we have an agenda, but really what it comes down to is, what we need to talk about as a group. And much to our dismay, sometimes that can go entirely a different direction. But at the end of the day, we're still achieving something that the tribes deem as a priority. And so as staff, we are kind of charged with like, okay, that kind of took like a 180, but let's see what we can do with this momentum that we've gained. And so that's another piece that's critical to our work, which is like really respecting that tribal sovereignty and just kind of letting the work move forward and just being really kind of the cheerleaders of it and helping our tribal leaders like cement all of the knowledge and all of the vision that they're putting forward. And then we have a number of projects and programming that basically helps implement these values. I do really want to have Lauren have time to like walk you through this. So really quickly, where I wanted to get to was starting to draw out what these values are and how we actually start to operationalize them in the work. So some of the values that I really rely on in the work at Bears Ears is here to the left that you see. The first above all is relationality and our place in it. So you can see over here on the right, we have relatives are not resources. So I really like this because whenever we approach our work, I feel like when we are in these spaces with the agencies, they're always approaching things automatically from this hierarchy, right? This Western perspective of humans are above all. But when we're talking with our tribal leaders, when we are discussing, how we want to care for water, for instance, we're no longer viewing water as down here at the bottom of the tier. As you can see over here on the right, water is actually equal to us, and therefore it actually has equal value and equal merit. And so therefore, when we are talking about managing it, we're really not talking about managing it. We're talking about how do we want to be in relation with water and how do we actually want to benefit each other from that relationship. So really, that's kind of how I think about our approach to land management planning. And Lauren has done a really good job of being able to help the tribes weave that together. You can read these other ones, but another one that I like to coach us in when we're thinking about visioning is this abundance value. So I like to include this because our lived experience as Indigenous people largely comes from scarcity as a result of a lot of harmful systems imposed on us. So ultimately, what this has created, it is a dynamic for tribal people to basically be fighting over scarce resources from the federal government. It makes us feel, as a result of blood quantum, that we are literally grasping for our life. And so in order to kind of counter and to really reset and frame ourselves in this healing kind of mentality, we actually need to place ourselves outside of those boundaries that are imposed on us. What would this look like if we didn't have all of those injustices that happen to us? What would this look like if we didn't have to fight for federal funding so that our children can have clean water, right? So when we place ourselves in this kind of mindset, we're able to actually vision the things that we actually want for this place and the way that this place is telling us it would like to be managed. Whoops, go back. Okay, so we are almost done with my part. Really quickly, if we go back to the Obama proclamation, it established the Bears Ears Commission, which is essentially the governing body that's responsible for providing traditional ecological knowledge and recommendations to the U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. This is kind of the way that Obama's proclamation really conceptualized and wanted to cement the idea of that legitimacy of traditional ecological knowledge. And so that's kind of the place that we're at now, is that the coalition is supporting the tribes in their effort to advise the federal agencies through the Bears Ears Commission. And so since we have started this, and since we have touched base with you all, we've done a number of different things to really start cementing this collaborative management. When we first started this process, it was relatively new, kind of a key term. And so I was able to kind of provide you some examples here on the right side of the products of collaborative management. So for instance, we have our Coalition Tribal Land Management Plan. As I already mentioned, that was developed between the tribes. It contains their actual long-term vision for how they would want the management or how they would want Bears Ears managed if we were acting out of that abundance mindset. The cooperative agreement, as you all likely know, is kind of just that agreement that the 5 tribes have with the U.S. Forest Service and BLM, and it largely just outlines the expectations of that relationship and how we're going to manage the land together. Lauren's realm is really the collaborative management itself, so that day-to-day of management, the planning processes, as well as our implementation plans that we're getting ready to line up. And then what I wanted to get to is where we are now, which is the release of our draft resource management plan. And at this point, I will hand it off.
Thanks, Charissa. You can go to the next slide, thanks. So what is the resource management plan? And when we're talking about our federal agency collaborators, we're talking about Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, just so folks kind of know what federal agencies we're referring to in these next slides. And sort of the dry bit of language that's associated with the resource management plan is that the intention of the resource management plan is to protect the objects and values. So these are things that are identified by the presidential proclamations that identified basically the national monument itself. And these can range from anything from wildlife species to places to cultural values within the monument that are thought to be important. And so there's both kind of this presidential identification of importance, but the tribes have their own objects and values as well that they identify as important in the monument. And the plan itself is basically just a set of options on how to manage the monument and protect these objects and values within the monument. It sort of outlines where and to what extent different uses can occur. So things like livestock grazing, motorized use, recreation, vegetation treatments, and how those are balanced with, making sure that this sacred landscape is protected and respected. It also talks about how the agencies and the commission, the Bears Ears Commission, will kind of implement the plan together, and outlines how traditional indigenous knowledge and traditional environmental or ecological knowledge will be incorporated to guide monument management. So there's a section kind of earlier on in the plan. I'll kind of highlight some sections. The plan itself is really long. So if you all don't have time to sit down and read all 700 pages of it, this is trying to give you a little bit of an overview of what's included in the plan and the ways that traditional indigenous knowledge have been incorporated. Then the approach is common to all action alternatives. So this means all of the options that are in the plan for managing the monument, these have to be included in every option. So all alternatives incorporate the intent of the cooperative agreement. So that agreement that was signed between the tribes and the federal agencies. There has to be shared stewardship commitment by both the tribes and the agencies. And there's a commitment to make sure that tribal knowledge is reflected in decision-making processes, both during this plan process and then also while this plan is being implemented in the future. And then there's also an acknowledgement of a more holistic land management philosophy. So not just seeing, yes, I can definitely increase my speaking voice, thank you. There's an acknowledgement of a holistic land management philosophy. So not just thinking about the monument as being these siloed resources. So, water is separate from wildlife, is separate from vegetation, but all of these things interact with one another. There's also to protect some of the monument objects, including petrified wood, fossils, plants. There's kind of prohibition on collection, except when it's kind of tribal traditional harvest, making sure that that's protected. Next, Charissa. There's also a tribal co-stewardship section, which might be of interest to folks here, and also outlines this obligation of the agencies to manage the monument in collaboration with the commission. The agencies commit to making sure that tribal knowledge is reflected. They make sure to engage in ongoing basis of dialogue, knowledge sharing, learning programs. So this kind of goes both ways, right? That could be kind of cultural sharing programs, cultural sensitivity trainings for agency staff, and making sure that the commission has the opportunity to review policy guidance prior to issuance. Also, again, the provisions of the cooperative agreement are very specifically included in this section as well. So those are sort of woven throughout the entire document. So this is kind of one of the examples of how the tribes and the coalition were trying to explain to the agencies and work within the confines of this NEPA process, of this planning process, but how to explain that the tribes don't see the monument as, again, these separate resources, but to see it as one kind of interconnected web. So this infographic is a spider's web where all of these radial threads and spiral threads kind of intersect. And the spiral threads are the portions of the landscape. So things like geology and minerals, paleontology, soil, vegetation. So all of these things that you would see when you're out on Bears Ears, and kind of going from earth to sky and recognizing that the radial threads, so things like recreation, grazing, travel and transportation, intersect with every single one of these important relatives, these important relations. And that if you pull on one of these threads, it pulls all of the other threads with it, right? It has an impact that ripples across the web. So trying to think about when we were writing the plan, or the tribes are collaborating with the agencies to write the plan, thinking about these intersections holistically and trying to incorporate that into the plan. There's also an element of seasonality that was included from the Cultural Resources Subcommittee and the Commission, with the understanding that all of these intersections, all of these resources, all of these relations change every season. And the way that they are managed likely needs to change seasonally as well. Next. So the kind of culmination of a lot of this work was in Alternative E, which is primary focus of the coalition and the commission during the planning process. And there's kind of 5 alternatives, A through E. And this is the preferred alternative, the agencies and the commission. This is the alternative that kind of includes the most from the tribal land management plan. It includes the most recommendations and expertise from the commission. Traditional indigenous knowledge is kind of more fully incorporated in this alternative than others. There's an emphasis on increased monitoring, which is a big push from the commission, especially of culturally important species, which aren't often monitored in these contexts. The use of seasonal and permanent closures for resource rest. And there's a lot of incorporation of permitting processes and committees to support tribal access to the monument. Next. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sections that have kind of been of most interest to the public so far, and a little bit about what Alternative E says for these sections or intends for these sections, just so you have a bit of background. First, it's unfortunately called water resources, but the tribes would like to think about it as, just water. But one of the priorities of the commission and the Cultural Resources Subcommittee was making sure that there's a comprehensive spring inventory and that there's a collaboration with the commission to develop a service water monitoring plan. There's also interest in supporting traditional use of springs, and then to kind of make sure that those springs and surface waters are protected to limit camping near intermittent surface waters, springs, or seeps. And then also to have the commission kind of heavily involved in making sure that water withdrawals are kind of approved by the commission are protecting the water resources of the monument. Forest and woodlands is a big one for our tribes because there's a lot of woodland harvest that's used by community members. So there's a process that's contemplated in Alternative E to create a permitting framework that makes it easier for folks to woodcut and harvest, and then make sure if there's any vegetation treatments, if there's any products resulting from kind of fuel treatments, that they are kind of delivered to tribal nations and to community members that need them. And then also to make sure that when there is harvest and thinning, it's not negatively impacting a lot of species that are using those woodlands as habitat. A big one is visual resource management and night skies. So emphasizing that view sheds are part of this earth to sky concept of coalition tribes, and to educate visitors about the importance of celestial observations, the importance of the moon and solar cycles, and the importance of natural darkness in the monument. And so what this means in kind of agency and plan language is to limit some of the classes that would allow for a lot of things that would potentially impact a view shed. So meaning that it would limit what's called VRM, or Visual Resource Management classes 3 and 4, and low SIO for the Forest Service. So kind of limiting the amount of structures that can be created in the monument, or the amount of water tanks that might obstruct these view sheds. Next. In terms of cultural resources, there's an attempt to kind of manage cultural resources in collaboration with Commission to minimize damage, of course, but to make sure that tribal nations at the Commission have access to and use of traditional cultural properties. One of the big things that is contemplated in the plan and in Alternative E is to make sure that there are data gaps that are addressed. to make sure that there's increased sharing and acquisition of data so that the data that the agencies have is shared with the tribes freely and kind of vice versa where it's appropriate. And that the agencies would promote and participate in cultural sensitivity trainings. Next. A big one is thinking about how folks are accessing the monument via either OHV use or kind of motorized use, and balancing making sure that folks are able to access the monument in a safe way, but also that that's not impacting the sacred landscape. The tribal management plan will be developed after the final plan is published. And there's a commitment to kind of work with the commission to identify any seasonal closures that are needed for resource rest or ceremonial use. And much of the monument in Alternative E is OHV limited, which means that it sort of gives the commission and the agencies more time to understand how community members, for example, are using the roads in the monument to maybe harvest plants or wood. Next. In terms of recreation, the tribes are in favor of an Alternative E implementing a zoned approach. So this means that different portions of the monument have kind of different restrictions based on visitation use. So it breaks it up into front country, passage, remote, and outback zones. Front country zones are zones that are along major roads and where primary visitation happens in the monument. So a lot of folks are, using their cars, using their RVs, getting out. There are bathrooms, there are facilities associated. So sort of concentrating the use in those areas, and then having a bit more of a natural or more remote experience in some of the far-reaching areas of Bears Ears. There's also interest from the commission to create monument-wide management prescriptions. So not just saying, okay, we'll focus management prescriptions for climbing on Indian Creek, but let's focus on management prescriptions for climbing across the entirety of the monument. Even if that climbing isn't in existence yet, these plans are intended to kind of have a relatively long lifespan. So let's have kind of a monument-wide approach that's easy to understand for all users. And the intention of Alternative E is to make sure that recreation access can still happen. So like Charissa was saying, folks can really enjoy the feeling that you get when you're in Bears Ears, but making sure that that is balanced with protecting the sacred landscape. Next. Livestock grazing is another use that happens on the monument. And Alternative E is interested in managing livestock grazing to protect monument objects. And there is now language in the plan that traditional Indigenous knowledge needs to inform all grazing management decisions, but there will be an adaptive management approach. So the impacts of livestock grazing will be monitored on the ground, and then management sort of catered to what that monitoring shows. There can be permanent or seasonal closures to grazing where there's impacts to riparian zones, archaeological sites, and a collaboration with the commission is contemplated in Alternative E to make sure that management practices are reassessed, that stocking levels are reassessed often to make sure that the landscape isn't being overgrazed or livestock is not impacting the monument negatively. So as you might imagine, in this collaborative relationship, there's some give and take. So there are some areas that the commission has identified as potential improvements to the resource management plan. And this is sort of not a comprehensive list necessarily, but some examples of improvement areas that might be important to share with the public, like you all. But for example, climate change could be kind of more fully acknowledged throughout all sections. Additionally, as much as this plan is really novel and really innovative in terms of its incorporation of traditional Indigenous knowledge, that could still be more fully incorporated throughout the plan. Again, tribal perspectives on recreation within this sacred landscape are not sort of fully reflected. There's some language about economic impacts on surrounding communities, and it's mostly geared towards focusing on the impacts to grazing permits and permittees, and doesn't really include a lot of the positive impacts that this plan might have to employment opportunities for tribal members. The BC doesn't have, or the Commission does not have a formal role in the designation of areas of critical environmental concern. And this is a sort of a policy lever that can protect certain areas from development, from water withdrawals, et cetera. And then kind of the negative impacts of livestock grazing that we all sort of have a concept of in Western ecosystems are not fully acknowledged within the plan as well. Okay, so I think we're doing okay on time, but I want to make sure that there's time for questions, and this is our last couple slides. The public comment period, the plan was released on March 8th, so it's open to the public, and the public comment period is 90 days total, and it ends on June 11th. So this is a very timely webinar if folks are interested in kind of expressing their opinions, their concerns, their personal experience, any information that they might have about Bears Ears. This is the time to do it. So anyone can submit a public comment through e-planning by mail or in person. And I think actually the in-person meetings are through, so apologies about that, but e-planning and mail are still available. And I think at the very end of the presentation, we have a QR code that you all can scan to take you directly to submit a public comment if you are interested. Yes, I think that's all we have. And we're ready for questions if you all have them. And then again, we'll share that QR code at the end as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I think our group is small enough that we can just go ahead and put the hand up signal, or just put your hand up and we'll just call on you and ask the questions. So who's got a question? Pam.
Looking for my hand. Yeah, so originally it was the Grand Staircase Escalante Bears Ears National Monument. So where's the other part of the monument? Does that still exist, or what's going on with that?
Do you want to take that, Lauren?
Oh, I can start, and if you have any additional information, Charissa, I think there's now the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument, which actually the management plan came out for a couple months ago as well. And you'll see some parallels with Bears Ears, and they're also trying to establish a kind of an advisory body from tribal nations that have ancestral ties to Grand Staircase. But they don't have a commission-like body that was set up in presidential proclamation. So they have kind of a different structure, but you'll see some parallels in that management plan, especially in like the zoned approach to recreation. But yeah, there is a monument now for Grand Staircase as well. They're just separated.
Okay.
And then we have Francis, Rose, and then Laura.
I have a question. I don't know if it's silly, but Bears Ears is in Utah, correct? How is that in relation to the old Sherman Ranch, which is now a television series episodes called Skinwalker Ranch? Is Bears Ears near that? Because there's a lot of interesting archaeological finds on Skinwalker.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in there? Is it near there?
So I am familiar with the so-called Skinwalker Ranch, and I would say it's a little bit further north than Bears Ears. So I should have described that the Bears Ears National Monument is actually in the southeastern corner of Utah. So it kind of like literally is really close to Colorado and Arizona. So I believe those types of archaeological sites that you're speaking to, Francis, are a little closer to Fort Duchesne.
It's struck my interest because there's Native Americans that are living near there, and I was wondering, if that was associated with it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And then Rose?
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. I guess I have two questions. One, I'd be curious to know, what are the tribal perspectives on recreation? Because you said that was not fully addressed. And then when you're done answering that, I have an additional question regarding livestock grazing. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, Rose, I can go first. So, and thank you for this question. So what are the tribe's views on recreation? I think you're probably not going to like the answer. I think they're still trying to figure it out. And that's why Lauren and I wanted to be here, because our tribes are really interested in learning how you recreate and what that means to you. And I say that because every time we have discussions around recreation, some of our tribes who may have more of a spiritual connection or a spiritual kind of like everyday life have a really hard time conceptualizing recreation in the Western frame. So for instance, when we come to them and we'll say, what do you want to do for hiking recommendations? How do you want people to hike on this landscape? We actually have to take a couple step back, and our folks are really interested in like, well, what does that mean? Like, what are people doing when they hike? And so a lot of the answers that we get to that question are like, well, we see Bears Ears as a church. And so we wouldn't necessarily approach it as like a thing for us to just get out and go and experience it. And I want to say this very carefully. Rather, they would go on a hike so that they can connect with nature, or rather like clear their head or try and let go of something heavy that's weighing on them. So it's more of a spiritual experience than it is straight recreational. And so I think we're still trying to weave that connection of like, how do the tribes want to weigh in on recreational management, because they do want people to continue to enjoy this landscape. I think they just want you all and everybody else to know how important and how special this place is to them.
Okay, thanks. I guess the other comment that I have is regarding the livestock grazing, which you said, was not adequately addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with that entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it is adequately addressed, as in Canyons of the Ancients National Monument, they had a pretty robust resource management plan, flawed still, but very strong and specific language regarding livestock grazing. And it has been virtually ignored by the Bureau of Land Management. So one of the big concerns that many have is BLM management may equate to continued status quo management of livestock grazing, where most of those landscapes are failing to meet rangeland health already or have never been assessed.
Mm-hmm.
And, looking at your spider web and all the different resources, livestock grazing is the most ubiquitous and destructive use that's out there. Hands down, every acre, every place practically, unless you have to fly to get there. And so, the riparian, the soils, the water, the wetlands, the vegetation, the woodlands, the wildlife, the fish, and humans are all being adversely impacted by this use. And so to see a lack of strong voice from the tribal coalition is disappointing, especially given that, raising cattle is not something that goes back centuries in your cultures. So it just seems conflicted, and there's very few of the permittees in that landscape that are indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of, how do we say it, old white men who are permittees out there. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, do you want to start, Laura, or do you want me to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I think in any land planning process where it's, the first of its kind between federal agencies and tribes, there's certainly some level of compromise. But also, I think the intention of the commission and the commission tribes is to, over time, kind of use monitoring data. And one of the prescriptions in the monument management plan is for a cultural rangers program to have kind of tribal stewards out in the landscape to monitor the impacts of grazing. Because right now there's not a lot of data on the negative impacts of grazing specifically on the monument, even though there's quite a bit of data on the Colorado Plateau, on Western ecosystems in general. So to have that increased monitoring data, and additionally to be able to set, so you mentioned rangeland health standards, like the tribes and tribal kind of departments of natural resources are interested in kind of developing their own standards. So even, I think I was looking at the rangeland health this morning, and quite a few of the areas in Bears Ears are meeting BLM rangeland health currently, but those rangeland health standards are not ones that necessarily the tribes ascribe to, and they're interested in taking their time to identify their own standards, identify resource thresholds. So things like if there is, a certain percentage of needle and thread grass that goes below a certain level in a permittee's allotment, that would trigger an adaptive management approach. So I think some of the kind of lack of strong recommendations that you're seeing at this moment is to give the tribes more time to be able to gather data, to identify their own rangeland health standards, to monitor culturally important species that don't have data right now, and sort of push for those within the monument.
I would suggest the need for very specific language then in the RMP that puts emphasis and actual actionable clout on those tribal recommendations. Otherwise, the language is per BLM management, which means deferring to the existing lacking rangeland health standards, but that's all we've got. I would also say, the ideas of adaptive management and reassessing and monitoring and all are laudable and are very idealistic, but not realistic. Again, based on other national monuments that had strong directive language in their RMP, and statements like if an allotment becomes vacant, you're not going to put livestock back if there's impacts to cultural resources and it's not meeting rangeland health, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the criteria is being met, and the BLM has been fighting hard to put cattle back out there. It's an insanity. And so how can we strengthen this to prevent that? Also, the proclamation includes permanent grazing retirement from willing permittees. And so the idea that the tribal coalition could put stronger language forward, or we all could encourage a stronger stance for proper livestock management, could be a trigger for a permittee decide to take a buyout and remove livestock from a lot of this acreage. So I would encourage everyone to focus on how do we leverage that potential power to remove livestock through the RMP process in our comments.
Thanks, Rose. That's really good advice. And then Laura. And then we'll get to some of the questions in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, Rose, of course, as she always does so well, anticipated my question already. So you guys have answered a lot of that, but I wanted to say I work for Western Watersheds Project, and I'm going to be writing the comments for my group. And we have also noticed we have been encouraged really strongly to support Alt-E because it has some really good language about, tribal input on various, many aspects of monument management. But the livestock grazing one, there's some conflicts there, as Rose said, and we'd like to recommend some stronger language. And I was looking at the Bears Ears land use plan, and I've noticed that I really want to advocate for range riders that they have in there, for example. And I'd really want to advocate for Alt-D, but I want to be able to say that in such a way that is also supported by the tribes. I feel like I can say that pretty well when if it's in the land use plan, then that is supported by the tribes. So I can make a strong case for them, that they should consider a requirement to have range riders on land management for the allotments and for livestock grazing. For the closures that are proposed in Alternative D, since it's not in Alternative E, and that's the one that is supported by the tribes, then it's hard for me to make an argument for it just from something that this is something that the tribes, would also be in favor of. I can't say that really. So, I want to make sure that I'm supportive of the tribal position without overstepping or going too far, or saying things that, aren't right. But I have to go outside supporting Alternative E to do that. So how do you, can I say that there is tribal support for more closures? You're smiling, so maybe you've already dealt with this.
Hi, Laura. Yeah, I think something that we've been communicating to NGO partners and members of the public is that both the tribes and the agencies need a well-rounded set of public comments to be able to continue with this plan, to choose the correct combination of alternatives, whether that's Alternative D for livestock grazing closures or E. And I think that a lot of our NGO partners are really interested in making sure that they're kind of in line with tribes, but that I think that our commissioners are really interested in hearing from the public, really interested in hearing your expertise, really interested in hearing what's happening in other areas and how that might impact decisions that have to come after this public comment period. So I would absolutely encourage you to push for the livestock grazing closures in D. I think they've said that also our tribes and nations are not necessarily a monolith, right? The commissioners don't always necessarily speak for all of their community members, and that's why we've been also trying to get out into community and hear the different perspectives that exist within each of these communities. So I think that extends to you all as well, to kind of make your voice heard and your expertise heard within the comments, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple from the comments from the messages. So Anne is asking, are wilderness management addressed in the management plan? The management of wilderness.
Yes, there's a whole section on plants with wilderness characteristics. Yep, there's a huge wilderness section in the plan that I think I would point you to. Yeah, that is pretty prescriptive.
Okay, great. And then Claudia wants to know what sort of monitoring protocols are being implemented and who is carrying out the monitoring. And I'm not sure in regards to what. So Claudia, if you want to speak up, that would be great. If not, we could just.
I was thinking more in terms of vegetation, but because I think the grazing has been addressed quite extensively, but the vegetation, but also the springs. I'm familiar with a group called the Spring Stewardship Institute, and I believe they've been out maybe this year already doing some work. I don't know if it's been directly for you guys or not, but I know they do some pretty cool work. But yeah, the vegetation and the springs, you know, the water resources.
Thanks, Claudia. I think when you were asking Sally about what areas, I think you'll see throughout most of the plan, kind of upon the urging of the tribes, that there is increased monitoring in almost every section, contemplated in almost every section. And so, yeah, the organization that you mentioned, Claudia, has been involved with starting that cumulative spring inventory. And then I think the kind of one of the big programs and projects that the coalition is interested in kind of getting off the ground is cultural rangers programs. There's something similar to kind of Guardian Watchman programs and the Guardian Watchman network that exists in Canada, where basically tribal members are employed to be out on the monument and basically monitoring everything at once. And this has been a very successful program in other areas of the country and other places in the world. Where kind of folks are out all the time, sometimes living in different areas and monitoring basically every use of the landscape. So that could be vegetation, that could be livestock grazing impacts, could be wildlife connectivity. There's kind of contemplated monitoring across all resource levels and hoping for an integrated monitoring program. And that it's going to take us a little while to get off the ground. So right now we kind of rely on NGO partners. We rely on these different organizations to kind of help us with this monitoring. But now that there are specific prescriptions, we're going to have to figure out who is doing the monitoring in the place of the cultural rangers while we get that program kind of up and running.
Thank you. And then we have one. So it's 4:59. Can we go about 5 more minutes? You okay? Everyone okay with that? Because we have 2 more questions. The first one is from Jan, who says, I was a volunteer on an archaeological trip on the Forest Service part of the monument. I didn't even know that was part of under the Forest Service. Is there generally agreement between the Forest Service and the BLM in the management directions?
Kind of depends topic by topic. I think that as this monument has been kind of an intertribal effort and there has to be consensus between the tribes, it's also been an interagency effort and they sort of have to reach consensus amongst each other as well. And then we all have to come together. And so it's quite a few organizations and governments coming together trying to kind of build consensus over one monument, over one management plan. I would say generally, yes, they're kind of on the same page or able to reach the same page. Yeah, for sure.
And then Pam, you put your hand down, but you had your hand up for a while. Do you have another question?
Well, I was just curious. So the Bears Ears Commission, they're advising the feds. So I'm wondering, you know, I mean, even in the past, like the feds were supposed to be talking to the tribes and consulting with them. So on this particular exercise, does the tribe feel like you're actually going to have some say? And one, when the rubber meets the road and it looks like they're not, you know, honoring what they agreed to with the tribes, do you have some way to challenge that?
I think there are several levers that are useful in this process that maybe haven't been fully present in other circumstances of tribal and federal collaboration. So one is the combination of the requirement of the presidential proclamations to incorporate tribal expertise, and then the cooperative agreement, I think, is helpful. And then the plan has been kind of another layer. So we're basically trying to layer protection and layer language that makes sure that the commission has to be involved in decision-making processes. I mean, I think there's limitations for sure. The agencies and the federal government are not, willing to delegate authority. But I think we're trying to layer as many protections as possible through language in these different plans.
I
Yeah,
think that's it.
And I would just
Yeah.
like to add really quickly onto what Lauren had provided is that the benefit of working with a coalition of tribes is that they can ultimately go directly to the president and enact their government to government and start speaking with decision makers if ultimately things aren't going the way that we would like it to go. So.
Great. Do you all have any closing remarks?
I do have one, Sally. I just I don't recall who it was, and I'm so sorry, but it was kind of pertaining to the grazing. And what I want to say is not only is this the first time that we are doing this, it's the first time that the agencies are doing this. And I want to be mindful, or rather recall that this is a relationship that the tribes have with the agencies, and therefore that relationship requires maintenance and care. And the thing that comes to mind when I say that is that, we're taught there's a time to be good relatives, and there's a time to be warriors. And we have to pick and choose. We can't always be both at the same time, and we can't always only be one, right? And so what I want to encourage to this group is that we, in times when we have to be good relatives, we are relying on our other relatives to be that warrior for us, because we do have to be in relationship with these agencies. And so what I wanted to say is that in fact, the reason why that this coalition is so powerful is that we do have such a broad network to rely on to be warriors in the spaces that we are not to, or that we are not allowed to, or rather where it may be better for us to be good relatives. And I think that's kind of what I want to end with. And I will also say that we have learned many things in this kind of first round, and we are hoping to share that with you all in a toolkit to be published next year. So that is one of those good lessons that you will be learning more about. And thank you so much for your time this evening. I'll hand it off to Lauren.
Thanks, Charissa. I don't think I can end it any better than that, other than to say that I put the link in the chat to submit public comments for our website if you all are interested. Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone.